The bitter wind howled across the southern range of the Diamond P Ranch, carrying with it a freezing rain that turned to ice the moment it touched the earth. Colton Prescott pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around his broad shoulders and squinted against the onslaught, knowing full well that the cattle in the South Pasture wouldn't survive the night if left unattended. It was January 1878, and Montana Territory had never felt so unforgiving. What had begun as a light flurry of snow that morning had transformed into a deadly sleet storm by afternoon, coating everything in sight with a treacherous sheen of ice. Colton had sent his ranch hands to bring in the northern herds hours ago, but he'd insisted on checking the South Pasture himself, a decision he was beginning to regret as daylight faded and the temperature continued to plummet. 30 head of cattle had wandered into that distant corner of his property, and he'd be damned if he'd lose them to the elements. At 32 years old, Colton had built the Diamond P from nothing but a dilapidated cabin and 50 acres of overgrazed land. Now, 5 years later, he owned 3,000 acres and a herd that was the envy of the territory and empire he'd constructed with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn determination. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Spur, picked his way carefully across the frozen ground. The animal's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as Colton guided him toward the cluster of pines that marked the border of his land. "Easy, boy," Colton murmured as Spur's hooves slipped slightly on the ice-slicked earth. "We'll get them home." The wind cut through him like a knife, despite the layers he wore. His face burned from the cold, and he could barely feel his fingers inside his leather gloves. But the thought of those cattle and the money they represented drove him forward. As he crested a small rise, he spotted the herd huddled together near a stand of cottonwoods, their backs turned to the wind in a futile attempt to shield themselves from the brutal weather. Relief flooded through him. At least they were all accounted for. He was about to start herding them back toward the ranch when something caught his eye, a splash of dark color against the white landscape, near the edge of his property where it bordered the old wagon trail. Frowning, he turned Spur in that direction. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a small wagon, tilted precariously to one side where a wheel had broken. No horse was in sight, but as Colton approached, he heard something that made his blood run cold despite the freezing temperature, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. He dismounted quickly, nearly losing his footing on the ice. Tying Spur to a nearby tree, he made his way cautiously toward the wagon. "Hello," he called, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "Anybody there?" The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. Colton reached the wagon and peered inside. What he saw made his heart stutter in his chest. A young woman was huddled in the back of the wagon, wrapped in what appeared to be every blanket and piece of clothing she owned. In her arms, she clutched a tiny bundle, the source of the crying. Her eyes, when they met his, were glassy with fear and exhaustion. "Help," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Please." Colton didn't hesitate. "I'm going to get you both out of here," he said firmly. "My ranch is about 2 miles back. Can you stand?" She tried to rise but collapsed back against the wagon's side, shaking her head weakly. I don't think so." "Then I'll carry you." He reached into the wagon, acutely aware of how fragile she appeared. "What's your name, madam?" "Rebecca," she said, her teeth chattering. "Rebecca Wilson." "And this is Emma. She's only 3 days old." Colton's chest tightened. A newborn out in this weather. It was a miracle the child was alive at all. "I'm Colton Prescott," he said, carefully lifting Rebecca and her child into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, despite the bundle of blankets. "Hold on to your little one. I've got you both." Rebecca nodded, clutching the baby to her chest. Colton carried them to where Spur waited, realizing immediately that getting both of them onto the horse would be a challenge. "I need you to trust me," he said. "I'm going to put you up on my horse and then I'll get on behind you." "The cattle," she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the herd. "They'll have to fend for themselves tonight," Colton replied, surprised by how easily he made the decision. Those cattle represented a significant investment, but the woman and child in his arms were worth far more. With considerable effort, he managed to get Rebecca and the baby onto Spur's back. He then mounted behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist while using the other to control the reins. "Lean back against me," he instructed. "I won't let you fall." Rebecca did as she was told, her body trembling violently against his chest. The baby had quieted somewhat, buried deep within the cocoon of blankets, but Colton knew they needed to reach shelter soon. "What happened?" he asked as he guided Spur back toward the ranch, hoping conversation might keep Rebecca alert. "Wheel broke," she replied, her words slurred slightly from the cold. "Horse spooked, ran off, been there since noon." Colton tightened his grip around her. 6 hours in this weather with a newborn, it was nothing short of miraculous that they were both still alive. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Silver Creek," she said. "My sister's there." Silver Creek was a small settlement about 20 miles west, a journey that would have been challenging even in good weather for a woman traveling alone with an infant. "Where's your husband?" Colton asked, immediately regretting the question when he felt Rebecca stiffen in his arms. "Dead," she said flatly. "Mining accident, 3 months ago." Colton fell silent, focusing instead on guiding Spur safely through the worsening conditions. The sleet was falling harder now, and darkness had descended completely, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He relied on instinct and Spur's sure-footedness to navigate the familiar terrain. When the lights of the ranch house finally appeared through the gloom, Colton felt Rebecca sag against him in relief. "Almost there," he assured her, his mouth close to her ear. "Stay with me." The main house of the Diamond P was a sturdy 2-story structure that Colton had built himself 2 years earlier. As they approached, the front door flew open, and Colton's housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, emerged onto the porch, a lantern held high. "Good heavens, Mr. Prescott," she exclaimed as Colton reined in Spur. "We were about to send out a search party." "Help me with her, Mrs. A," Colton called, dismounting carefully before reaching up to take Rebecca and the baby. "Found them stranded out by the south boundary. They're half frozen, Mrs." Abernathy's eyes widened at the sight of Rebecca and the tiny bundle in her arms, but she sprang into action immediately. "Bring them in. I've kept the fire going, and there's stew on the stove." Colton carried Rebecca into the house, the warmth of the front room hitting him like a physical force after the hours spent in the bitter cold. He laid Rebecca gently on the sofa nearest the fireplace, where flames leapt and crackled in the stone hearth. "The baby first," Rebecca insisted, trying to unwrap the bundle with fingers that could barely move. Mrs. Abernathy stepped in, gently taking the infant from Rebecca's arms. "Let me, dear. I've handled more babies than you've had hot dinners, Mr. Prescott." She carefully unwrapped the child, examining her with an expert eye. "She's cold, but her color's good. Little fighter, this one." Rebecca watched anxiously as Mrs. Abernathy checked the baby over. Is she going to be all right, right as rain, given a bit of warming up, Mrs. Abernathy assured her, rewrapping the baby in fresh, warm blankets from the stack beside the fire. "Now, let's see to you." Colton helped Rebecca out of her frozen outer clothes, draping a thick quilt around her shoulders. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair and eyes the color of summer sage. Despite the pallor of cold and exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her features that impressed him. "I'll make up the guest room, Mrs. Abernathy said, handing the bundled baby back to Rebecca. "And find something for this little one to sleep in." "Thank you," Rebecca said, her voice stronger now that she was beginning to warm up. She looked up at Colton, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Both of you, we would have died out there." Colton cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude in her gaze. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone would have been out in that weather looking for cattle," she countered. "You saved our lives, Mr. Prescott." Before Colton could respond, Mrs. Abernathy returned with a bowl of steaming stew. "Eat," she instructed Rebecca. "You'll need your strength if you're nursing that little one." Rebecca nodded, accepting the bowl gratefully. As she ate, Colton stepped away to remove his own wet outer garments, hanging his coat and hat by the door before pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey from the sideboard. The storm continued to rage outside, sleet pattering against the windows like tiny pebbles. Colton moved to stand by the fire, watching as Rebecca ate and tended to her daughter. There was something about the way she held herself, a dignity despite her desperate circumstances, that stirred something in him. "The guest room's ready," Mrs. Abernathy announced, returning to the front room. "And I've fashioned a little bed for the baby from a drawer and some blankets. It's not fancy, but it'll keep her safe and warm." "That's perfect," Rebecca said. "Thank you." Mrs. Abernathy helped Rebecca to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "You're exhausted, dear. A good night's sleep will do wonders." Rebecca turned to Colton before allowing herself to be led away. "The cattle, will you be going back for them?" The question surprised him. Most women of his acquaintance showed little interest in ranch matters. "Not tonight," he replied. "They'll bunch up together for warmth. I'll send my men out at first light if the weather breaks," she nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Good night, then, and thank you again, Mr. Prescott." After they'd gone upstairs, Colton poured himself another whiskey and settled into his favorite chair, staring into the flames. The South Pasture cattle represented a significant investment, but for the first time in years, his mind wasn't fixed on the ranch's bottom line. Instead, he found himself wondering about Rebecca Wilson, where she'd come from, what had driven her to attempt such a journey in the dead of winter, and what would become of her and her daughter now. Morning brought a temporary reprieve from the storm. The sleet had stopped, though the temperature remained well below freezing, preserving the icy coating on every surface. Colton rose before dawn, as was his habit, and found Mrs. Abernathy already at work in the kitchen. "How are our guests?" he asked, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. "Still sleeping," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "That poor girl was dead on her feet last night, and the baby such a tiny thing to be out in that weather." She shook her head disapprovingly. "What kind of woman travels alone with a newborn in the middle of winter?" "A desperate one," Colton said simply. He thought of Rebecca's words, her husband dead, heading for her sister's home. What choice had she had? He finished his coffee and headed out to the barn where his foreman, Jake Hollister, was already saddling horses. "Morning, boss," Jake greeted him. "Thought we'd head out to the South Pasture, see about those cattle." "Good plan," Colton agreed. "Take 2 of the boys with you. The ice is treacherous out there." Jake nodded, then hesitated. "Mrs. mentioned you brought in some strays of a different sort last night." Colton's mouth twitched at the description. "A woman and her baby. Found them stranded on the boundary line, wagon wheel broken. They'd have frozen to death if I hadn't come across them." "Lucky you were out there," Jake observed. "You planning to take them into town once the weather clears?" The question gave Colton pause. He hadn't thought that far ahead. She said she was heading for Silver Creek to her sister's place. "That's a fair piece," Jake said, adjusting his saddle. "And from the looks of things, we're in for more weather before it's done, barometers still falling." Colton glanced toward the house. "Let's see what the day brings. For now, those cattle are the priority." He spent the morning helping Jake and the other hands round up the cattle from the South Pasture. All 30 head had survived the night, though several showed signs of distress from the cold. By midday, they had the herd safely corralled near the barn, where they could be given extra feed and monitored. When Colton returned to the house for dinner, he found Rebecca seated at the kitchen table, her daughter sleeping peacefully in an improvised cradle nearby. She looked remarkably improved from the night before. Her cheeks had regained their color, and her hair, now clean and brushed, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Mr. Prescott," she said, starting to rise when he entered. "Please stay seated," he said quickly, "and call me Colton." "Mr. Prescott makes me feel like my father." A small smile touched her lips. "Colton, then. Mrs. Abernathy tells me you found all your cattle safe." "We did," he confirmed, removing his hat and hanging it by the door. "Tougher than they look, those beasts." "Like most living things, I suppose," Rebecca said softly, her gaze drifting to her daughter. Mrs. Abernathy bustled into the kitchen, carrying a steaming pot of stew. "Sit down, Mr. Prescott. You must be half-starved after being out in that cold all morning." Colton obeyed, taking the seat across from Rebecca. As Mrs. Abernathy served them both, he found himself studying his unexpected guest. In the daylight, he could see that her eyes weren't simply green, but flecked with gold, giving them an unusual luminosity. There was a smattering of freckles across her nose, and when she smiled, a small dimple appeared in her left cheek. "I was just telling Rebecca that you'll take her to Silver Creek once the weather improves," Mrs. Abernathy said as she placed a basket of bread on the table. Colton glanced out the window, where heavy clouds were once again gathering on the horizon. "I'm afraid that might not be for a few days. There's another storm coming in." Rebecca's face fell slightly, though she quickly composed herself. "I don't want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." "It's no imposition," Colton assured her. "The house is plenty big, and it's not as if you can continue your journey in this weather." "That's very kind of you," she said. "But I feel I should do something to earn my keep while I'm here." "Nonsense," Mrs. Abernathy interjected. "You need to rest and care for that baby." "I'm stronger than I look," Rebecca insisted, a hint of steel in her voice, "and I'm not used to idleness. Back home, I ran our household and helped my husband with his business affairs." Colton raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What sort of business?" "He was a mining engineer," Rebecca explained. "He handled the technical aspects, and I managed the accounts, correspondence, supply orders, everything else." Her expression clouded. "Until the accident?" "I'm sorry," Colton said, and meant it. "That must have been difficult, especially with a child on the way." Rebecca nodded, absently touching the gold band she still wore on her left hand. "It was challenging. The mining company provided some compensation, but not enough to maintain our home in Virginia City. My sister wrote offering a place for us in Silver Creek. She's a widow herself with 2 young children. We thought we could support each other." "A sensible plan," Colton said. "Though the timing is unfortunate." Rebecca's smile was tinged with irony. "Emma wasn't supposed to arrive for another 3 weeks. She had other ideas." As if on cue, the baby stirred in her makeshift cradle, letting out a small whimper that quickly escalated to a determined cry. Rebecca rose to attend to her, lifting the tiny bundle with practiced ease. "She's hungry," she explained, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "If you'll excuse me." "Of course," Colton said, standing as she left the room. He sat back down only when she had disappeared up the stairs, aware of Mrs. Abernathy's amused expression. "What?" he asked defensively. "Nothing at all, Mr. Prescott," she replied innocently. "Just noticing that you've remembered your manners is all." Colton grunted and returned his attention to his stew, though his thoughts remained with the young woman upstairs. It had been a long time since the Diamond P had housed a woman other than Mrs. Abernathy, who, with her 60 years and no-nonsense demeanor, hardly counted in the same category. Rebecca Wilson brought a different energy to the house, a softness that Colton hadn't realized was missing until now. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened ominously, and the first fat snowflakes had begun to fall. Colton stood on the porch, watching as the world was once again blanketed in white. This time, it was snow rather than sleet, a blessing in one sense, as it wouldn't form the treacherous ice of the previous day, but still a complication for anyone hoping to travel. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Rebecca joining him on the porch, wrapped in a shawl borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy. She'd left the baby inside, presumably sleeping. "Another storm," she observed, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Your foreman was right." Colton nodded. "Jake's been working this land almost as long as I have. He can read the weather better than most." Rebecca drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "How long have you had the Diamond P?" "5 years, Colton replied, though it didn't look much like this when I started. "Just a run-down cabin and a small herd. Took a lot of work to build it into what you see now." "You've accomplished a great deal," Rebecca said, her gaze taking in the well-maintained buildings, the sturdy corrals, the carefully planned layout of the ranch. "You should be proud." Colton shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what needed doing." "Don't dismiss it," she said. "Building something from nothing takes vision and determination. My father was like that, started with a small mercantile store and built it into the largest general goods supplier in 3 counties. Is he still in business? Colton asked. Rebecca shook her head. He and my mother died in a fire when I was 19, the store with them. Her voice held an old grief, well-worn but still present. That's when I moved to Virginia City and met James, my husband. Colton studied her profile as she gazed out at the falling snow. Despite the hardships she'd endured orphaned young, widowed while pregnant, now homeless with a newborn, there was no self-pity in her manner. Only a quiet resilience that he found himself admiring more with each passing hour. Your sister in Silver Creek, he said. What's her situation? Martha runs a small dressmaking shop, Rebecca explained. She's quite talented, but with 2 young children and no husband, she struggles to keep up with orders. I thought perhaps I could help with the business side of things as I did for James. Sounds like a solid arrangement, Colton agreed. Rebecca turned to face him, her expression earnest. I don't want you to think I'm the sort of woman who expects others to solve her problems, Mr. Prescott Colton. I've always made my own way. This situation, it's temporary. I never thought otherwise, he assured her. And there's no shame in accepting help when it's needed. Lord knows I've had my share of hard times when a helping hand made all the difference. She seemed about to ask him to elaborate, but the baby's cry sounded from inside the house, and Rebecca's attention immediately shifted. Excuse me, she said. Duty calls. Colton watched her go, struck by the strange sense of contentment that had settled over him despite the worsening weather and the disruption to his usual routine. There was something about Rebecca Wilson that called to something long dormant within him, a part of himself he'd set aside in the single-minded pursuit of building his ranch. The snow continued through the night and into the following day, accumulating steadily until it reached nearly 2 feet in depth. The temperature dropped further, turning the Diamond P into an island of warmth surrounded by a frozen wasteland. Colton and his men worked tirelessly to ensure the livestock were fed and sheltered, breaking ice in the water troughs and distributing extra hay to the cattle and horses. Inside the house, Rebecca quickly established herself as more than a helpless guest. Despite Mrs. Abernathy's protests, she insisted on contributing to the household chores, washing dishes, mending clothes, and even baking bread when Emma was sleeping. The baby, for her part, proved to be remarkably good-natured, crying only when hungry or wet, and spending the rest of her time observing the world with solemn dark eyes that Colton suspected would eventually turn green like her mother's. On the 3rd evening after Rebecca's arrival, as another snowstorm raged outside, Colton found himself sitting before the fire in the front room, a ledger open on his lap. He was attempting to update his accounts, a task he typically saved for bad weather days, but found his attention wandering repeatedly to Rebecca, who sat in the chair opposite, sewing a tiny garment for Emma. Is something wrong? She asked, glancing up to find him watching her. Colton cleared his throat, embarrassed at being caught staring. Not at all, just taking a break from these figures. Never was much good at bookkeeping. Would you like some help? Rebecca offered. It was always my favorite part of working with James, bringing order to the accounts. Colton hesitated, then nodded. I'd appreciate that, actually. Rebecca set aside her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the sofa, taking the ledger from his hands. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Colton felt a jolt of awareness at the contact. If Rebecca noticed, she gave no indication, her attention already focused on the columns of numbers before her. Your system is actually quite good, she observed, running her finger down the page. You're just inconsistent in how you record certain expenses. See here. She pointed to several entries. Sometimes you list feed purchases under livestock expenses and sometimes under general supplies. If you keep each category consistent, the totals will be more accurate. Colton leaned in to see where she was pointing, acutely conscious of her proximity. She smelled faintly of lavender, Mrs. Abernathy's soap, and something else that was uniquely her own, like sunshine on clean linen. That makes sense, he acknowledged. I never had much schooling in such things, learned as I went along. You've done remarkably well, Rebecca assured him. These accounts are far better kept than many I've seen from men with formal business education. The compliment pleased him more than it should have. My father always said I had a good head for business, even if I didn't have the patience for book learning. Tell me about your family, Rebecca said, setting the ledger aside. Are they nearby? Colton shook his head. My parents died years ago, cholera outbreak in '65. I was 20 at the time, already working on ranches in the territory. My younger brother, Matthew, went east to stay with our aunt. He's a lawyer in Boston now. Do you see him often? Not in years, Colton admitted. He writes occasionally, sent a fine pocket watch for my birthday last year. He pulled the silver timepiece from his vest to show her. Too fancy for ranch work, but I keep it close. Rebecca took the watch, admiring the intricate engravings on its case. It's beautiful. He must think highly of you. We were close as boys, Colton said. Different as could be him with his books, me always outdoors, but we looked out for each other. He paused, memories surfacing. After our parents died, I wanted him to stay with me, but I was in no position to care for a 14-year-old. Our aunt could give him a proper home, education. It must have been difficult to let him go, Rebecca said softly. Colton nodded, surprised at how easily the words came. Hardest thing I ever did, but it was right for Matt. He's married now, has 2 children, living the life he was meant for. And you? Rebecca asked. Is this the life you were meant for? The question caught him off guard. Never really thought about it that way, he admitted. Just knew I wanted land of my own, something to build. The Diamond P has been my whole focus for so long, I don't much think beyond it. No thoughts of a family? Rebecca's question was gentle, without presumption. Colton shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Hard to start a family out here, not many women willing to take on the life of a rancher's wife. It's rough living, isolated. The few eligible women in these parts tend to prefer the merchants and bankers in town. Some women might prefer the honesty of ranch life, Rebecca observed. The connection to the land, the satisfaction of building something lasting. Their eyes met, and Colton felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Before he could respond, however, Emma's cry sounded from upstairs, breaking the moment. Rebecca rose immediately. She's right on schedule, she said with a small smile. Never misses a feeding. After she'd gone upstairs, Colton remained by the fire, turning their conversation over in his mind. It had been a long time since he'd spoken so openly about his past, his family, the choices that had shaped his life. Something about Rebecca made it easy to share these parts of himself, parts he usually kept carefully guarded. The storm continued for 3 more days, effectively cutting off the Diamond P from the outside world. During that time, a routine of sorts developed. Colton would rise before dawn to help his men with the essential ranch chores, returning to the house for meals where he'd find Rebecca and Emma, the former increasingly involved in the household's operation, the latter growing visibly stronger and more alert each day. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit before the fire, Colton often working on ranch business, Rebecca sewing or caring for Emma, and talk. He told her about his early years working cattle drives, the wild days of the territory before statehood seemed imminent, how he'd saved every penny to buy his first piece of land. She shared stories of her childhood in a bustling Colorado town, her father's business acumen, her mother's love of books that had instilled in Rebecca a similar passion. Colton found himself looking forward to these evening conversations with an eagerness that both puzzled and alarmed him. Rebecca Wilson was a temporary guest in his home, bound for her sister's house as soon as weather permitted. Allowing himself to become attached to her, or worse, to her daughter, whose tiny hand had already wrapped itself firmly around his heart, was a recipe for disappointment. Yet he couldn't seem to help himself. There was something about Rebecca's quiet strength, her intelligence, her ability to find joy despite her circumstances, that drew him inexorably toward her. And Emma, with her solemn gaze and increasingly frequent smiles, had awakened a tenderness in him that he hadn't known he possessed. On the morning of the 7th day after Rebecca's arrival, Colton awoke to find the world transformed. The storm had passed during the night, and the sun now shone brilliantly on the snow-covered landscape, turning it into a dazzling expanse of white. The temperature had risen enough to begin the slow process of melting, and from his bedroom window, Colton could see his men already at work clearing paths between the buildings. It was, he realized with a pang, the kind of day when travel would soon be possible again. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where he found Rebecca already up, Emma cradled in one arm while she helped Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast with the other. "Morning," he greeted them, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened when Rebecca smiled at him. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said, nodding toward the window where sunlight streamed in. "I've never seen snow sparkle quite like that. It's the dry air here," Colton explained. "Makes everything sharper somehow." Mrs. Abernathy placed a plate of hot cakes and bacon before him. "Eat up," she instructed. "Rebecca's been teaching me her mother's recipe. Best hot cakes I've ever made, if I do say so myself." Colton took a bite and had to agree. "These are exceptional," he said, meeting Rebecca's eyes across the table. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Wilson." "Rebecca, please," she reminded him. "And it's hardly surprising that a woman knows how to cook." "It's surprising when she does it better than Mrs. A," Colton replied with a wink at his housekeeper. "I didn't think that was possible," Mrs. Abernathy harumphed, but there was no heat in it. Colton had noticed over the past week that the older woman had taken to Rebecca with unusual warmth, treating her almost like the daughter she'd never had. "The road to Silver Creek should be passable in a few days," Colton said, forcing himself to broach the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Once my men have cleared our main trail, we can get your wagon fixed and be on our way." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, of course, I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already." "Nonsense," Mrs. Abernathy interjected. "Having you and this little angel here has been a pleasure." She stroked Emma's cheek gently. "The house will be too quiet when you're gone." Colton silently agreed, though he said nothing. Instead, he finished his breakfast and headed out to join his men, needing the physical exertion to clear his head. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity as the ranch returned to its normal operations after the storm. Cattle had to be counted, fences checked for damage, and supplies inventoried. Colton threw himself into the work with an intensity that left him exhausted by nightfall, too tired, he hoped, to dwell on thoughts of Rebecca's imminent departure. Jake and 2 of the hands managed to retrieve Rebecca's wagon from where it had been abandoned, hauling it back to the ranch where the broken wheel could be repaired. Her horse had been found as well, sheltering in a stand of pines several miles away, apparently unharmed by its ordeal. On the evening before their planned departure for Silver Creek, Colton found himself restless after supper. Rebecca had gone upstairs to put Emma to bed, and Mrs. Abernathy had retired early, complaining of a headache. Left alone with his thoughts, Colton paced the front room, pausing occasionally to stare into the fire as if it might provide answers to the questions plaguing him. He was still standing there when Rebecca returned, now without Emma. She paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "She's finally asleep," she said softly. "She's been fussy all evening, as if she knows we're leaving tomorrow." Colton turned to face her, struck anew by her quiet beauty in the firelight. "Babies are more perceptive than we give them credit for." Rebecca moved to stand beside him at the hearth. "I want to thank you, Colton," she said earnestly, "not just for saving our lives that day, but for everything since. Your generosity, your kindness. It's been more than I could have hoped for." "You don't need to thank me," Colton said gruffly. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Rebecca countered. "And even if it were, it doesn't diminish what you've done for us." There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with things unsaid. Colton found himself studying her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the exact shade of her eyes, the way her hair caught the firelight. "Rebecca," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. She looked up at him expectantly, and something in her gaze gave him courage. "I've been thinking," he continued, his voice low. "Silver Creek is a good 20 miles from here. The roads are still rough, and traveling with a newborn is risky, especially this time of year." Rebecca nodded slowly. I know, but Martha is expecting us and I don't want to worry her. We could send word, Colton suggested. Let her know you're safe, that you'll come when Emma is a bit older, when travel is easier. Hope flickered briefly in Rebecca's eyes before caution replaced it. What are you saying, Colton? He took a deep breath. I'm saying that you and Emma could stay here, not just until spring, but longer if you wanted to. As what? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Your housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, already fills that role admirably. No, Colton said firmly. Not as my housekeeper. He reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. Her skin was soft, though he could feel calluses forming from her recent work around the ranch, testament to her willingness to contribute, to be part of the life here. I know it's sudden, he continued. We've known each other only a short time, but these days with you and Emma, they've changed something in me, Rebecca, made me realize what I've been missing. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. Colton, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for promises, just time. Time for us to know each other better, to see if what I'm feeling might be something you could feel too. Time for Emma to grow stronger before you undertake a difficult journey. Rebecca was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face as if looking for answers there. And what exactly are you feeling? She finally asked. Colton swallowed hard, unused to putting such things into words. I'm feeling like the Diamond P was just a place until you and Emma came. Now it's starting to feel like a home. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning softly around the eaves of the house, a reminder of the storm that had brought them together. I've been on my own for so long, Rebecca said at last. First after my parents died and then after James. I learned to rely on myself to make my own decisions. The thought of depending on anyone else is frightening. I'm not asking you to depend on me, Colton said earnestly. I admire your independence, your strength. I'm asking for a chance for us to build something together as equals. Rebecca's free hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that made his heart race. And Emma. Emma already has a place here, Colton said without hesitation. She had me wrapped around her tiny finger the moment I saw her. A smile bloomed slowly across Rebecca's face, like sunshine breaking through clouds. Then I think, she said carefully, that Martha can wait a while longer for our visit. Colton felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost painful. Impulsively, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that she returned with a sweetness that made his knees weak. When they parted, Rebecca's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. I should check on Emma, she murmured, though she made no move to step away from him. I'll come with you, Colton offered, suddenly reluctant to let her out of his sight even for a moment, if that's all right. She nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she led him upstairs to the guest room where Emma slept. The baby lay in her makeshift cradle, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, one small fist curled beside her face. She looks like you, Colton observed quietly, peering down at the sleeping infant. Everyone says she has her father's nose, Rebecca replied, a touch of sadness in her voice. Colton placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She'll know about him, he promised. When she's older, you'll tell her about her father, what kind of man he was, how much he would have loved her. Rebecca leaned into his touch, grateful for his understanding. Thank you, she whispered. They stood together watching Emma sleep, the simple intimacy of the moment sealing something between them that needed no further words. The following morning, Colton dispatched one of his men to Silver Creek with a letter from Rebecca to her sister, explaining the change of plans. Martha's reply came a week later, relief at hearing her sister and niece were safe, understanding about the delayed visit, and an open invitation to come when they were ready. Winter gradually released its grip on the Montana territory, giving way to the tentative green of early spring. The snow melted, revealing the dormant grasses beneath, and the cattle were turned out to graze on the fresh growth. As the land awakened, so too did the bond between Colton and Rebecca, deepening with each passing day. They were married on a bright May morning, with Emma, now 4 months old and plump with health, cradled in Mrs. Abernathy's arms as they spoke their vows before the preacher who had ridden out from town for the occasion. The ranch hands stood as witnesses, their weather-beaten faces unusually solemn for the ceremony, though they made up for it with boisterous celebration afterward. "Mrs. Prescott," Colton murmured that evening when they were finally alone, "has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Rebecca smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the same happiness he felt. "It does," she agreed, "though I'm not sure I'll ever get used to it. We have a lifetime for you to practice," he assured her, drawing her into his arms. As spring turned to summer, Rebecca proved herself as adept at ranch life as she had been at managing mining accounts. She took over the Diamond P.T.K.S. books, implementing systems that increased efficiency and profitability. She established a kitchen garden that supplied fresh vegetables for the house and hands alike. And she transformed the main house from a functional bachelor's residence into a true home, with touches of comfort and beauty that Colton had never thought to include. Emma thrived in the clean Montana air, growing from a solemn-eyed infant into a cheerful baby who charmed everyone she encountered. Colton found in fatherhood a joy he had never anticipated, delighting in each of Emma's milestones as if she were his own flesh and blood. In late summer, they made the journey to Silver Creek, where Martha welcomed them with open arms. The sisters' reunion was tearful and joyous, and Martha took to Colton immediately, declaring him exactly what Rebecca needs, even if she didn't know it. They stayed for a week, during which time Colton helped Martha with some much-needed repairs to her small house, and Rebecca assisted her sister in reorganizing her business accounts. When they departed, it was with promises of regular visits and an invitation for Martha and her children to spend Christmas at the Diamond P. Autumn brought with it the cattle roundup, the busiest time of year for the ranch. Colton worked from dawn until well after dusk, returning to the house each night exhausted but satisfied. No matter how late the hour, he would find Rebecca waiting for him, often with Emma asleep on her shoulder, a meal kept warm by the stove. "You don't have to wait up," he told her one particularly late night in October, as he sank gratefully into a chair at the kitchen table. "I like waiting for you," she replied simply, placing a plate before him. "It gives me time to think about how fortunate I am." Colton caught her hand before she could move away, pulling her down onto his lap despite her laughing protests. "I'm the fortunate one," he insisted. "Do you have any idea how empty this place was before you and Emma came into my life?" Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand coming up to cradle his cheek. "It was a good life before us," she said softly. "You built something remarkable here, Colton." "It was a half-life," he corrected her. "All work and purpose, no joy. Now I have both." Rebecca smiled, a secretive curve of her lips that caught his attention. "Speaking of joy," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently against her abdomen, "how would you feel about adding a bit more to our lives?" Colton stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment before understanding dawned. "Are you saying?" Rebecca nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when he was out checking on old Pete's broken arm. We'll have a new addition to the family come spring." Colton felt a surge of emotion so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He pulled Rebecca closer, burying his face against her neck as he struggled to contain the overwhelming joy that threatened to burst from his chest. "I take it you're pleased," Rebecca said, laughter in her voice as she stroked his hair. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," Colton replied, lifting his head to meet her gaze. "I love you, Rebecca Prescott, more than I ever thought possible. And I love you," she whispered back. "My cowboy who carried us in from the cold." As winter once again approached, bringing with it the memory of their first meeting, Colton often found himself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought Rebecca and Emma into his life. If the cattle hadn't wandered into the south pasture, if the sleet hadn't forced him to go looking for them, if Rebecca's wagon wheel hadn't broken. So many small events that had led to such profound change. The Diamond P continued to prosper under their joint stewardship, its reputation for quality stock spreading beyond the territory. But more importantly, It had become what Colton had always wanted without fully recognizing it, not just a successful ranch, but a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of future generations to carry on what he had begun. 1 year to the day after he had found Rebecca and Emma stranded in the storm, Colton stood on the porch of their home, watching as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. Behind him, through the window, he could see Rebecca seated by the fire, Emma playing at her feet with the wooden blocks he had carved for her during the long evenings of the previous winter. The south pasture, visible from where he stood, lay peaceful under the gathering snow. The cattle already moved to more sheltered areas in anticipation of the coming storm. The scene was a sharp contrast to that fateful day a year ago when ice had coated every surface and the bitter wind had cut through clothing as if it were paper. The front door opened, and Rebecca joined him on the porch, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. Her belly, now visibly rounded with their child, pressed against his side as she tucked herself against him. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked, following his gaze toward the south pasture. "Grateful ones," Colton replied, his arm tightening around her waist, "for sleet and broken wagon wheels." Rebecca laughed softly, the sound as warming as the blanket they shared, an unusual list of blessings. "They brought me to you," he said simply, "or you to me. Either way, I count them as the most fortunate events of my life." As the snow fell more heavily around them, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the world transform once again. But unlike the year before, there was no fear in the approaching storm, no isolation in the winter that stretched ahead. Instead, there was only the certainty of shared warmth, of love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings, and the knowledge that whatever the seasons might bring, they would face it together. In the years that followed, the story of how Colton Prescott had found his wife and daughter stranded in a sleet storm became something of a legend in the territory, embellished with each telling, until it took on the quality of a tall tale. But those who knew them best understood that the true miracle was not in the dramatic rescue, but in what had grown from it. A love as enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel over the Diamond P, and a family that brought meaning to the empire Colton had built. And when their children asked, as children inevitably do, how their parents had met, Colton would always begin the story the same way. It was the coldest winter in memory, and the sleet had frozen the south pasture solid as stone.